Hello and welcome again to our fifth lecture of this special lecture series. Previously we talked about the constitutional development of the Indo-Pak subcontinent, and we covered various acts including the Government of India Act 1858 and the Government of India Act 1919. Now, the Government of India Act 1858 didn't really provide much of a mechanism of how to set up a government at the center or the provinces and the administrative duties and so. Compared to it, the Government of India Act 1919 was a major improvement. It laid a foundation of how the government would be set up, the different roles and responsibilities. However, it still failed to live up to the aspirations of the people of India and had a great deal of shortcomings. Chief among the shortcomings were that with the introduction of system of diarchy at the provinces, provincial autonomy was not fully given. The principle of responsible government was only partially introduced, as the ministers were responsible to the legislature only against the subjects which appeared in the transferred list and not the reserved list, because only the councillors who were on the executive council of the governor of a province were put in charge. At the center, the Governor General was only responsible to the British Parliament through Secretary of State of India. As such, there was no concept of principle of responsible government at the center. The Governor General would decide which subject would appear in the central list and which subjects would appear in the provincial list. And for subjects which were appearing in the provincial list and the subjects which were within their legislative competence, there were certain areas, certain subjects where the prior sanction of governor was required, Governor General, before a bill could be introduced in the legislatures. But perhaps the biggest hurdle of the Government of India Act 1919 was with relation to the subject of finance. You see, finance appeared in the reserved list, and so ministers were unable to implement their programs for want of funds because it were the councillors who were put in charge of the subject. Same goes with the Indian civil service. Even though the ministers were required to implement their policies through the members selected in the Indian civil service, but since they were recruited by the Secretary of State, they were responsible to the Secretary of State, and this also created somewhat of a problem. Furthermore, there were areas where the Governor General could act otherwise than in accordance with the advice of his ministers, and this would be the governor, where he felt that it was required by him as essential for the discharge of his responsibilities for a reserved subject. So all in all, because of these shortcomings, there were persistent demands being made that there should be a more coherent system where the principle of responsible government should be both at the center as well as at the provinces. And so in the month of September 1925, a resolution was carried in the central legislature advising the British government to make fundamental changes in the constitution to make it more responsible. And so because of the persistent demands by all the political parties, in the month of November 1927, the British government appointed a statutory commission which was to be headed by Sir John Simon, also called as the Simon Commission. Now, the problem with this Simon Commission was that it comprised of only Englishmen, though it was asked to inquire into the reporting of the Government of India Act 1919. This decision to exclude Indians from such an important commission which would determine the future constitution of India was boycotted by all the political parties. An all-parties conference was formed in the year 1928. A meeting was held in Bombay in the month of May, where they appointed Motilal Nehru, the father of Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, to head the committee, and so followed the famous Nehru Report. Some of the salient features of the Nehru Report were that they envisaged and prescribed for a federal form of government, not a unitary form of government, and that the principle of responsible government should be introduced both at the center as well as at the provinces. They also prescribed for some 19 fundamental rights, mainly right to religion, right to assembly, right to speech, something which was not considered or recognized in any other earlier document. And they also called for that the respective powers of a provincial legislature, the subjects should be demarcated, they should be enumerated. It should not just be the Governor General who should decide, and the residuary powers should go to the center. However, this Nehru report was rejected by the Muslim League, and there were certain points where they didn't see eye to eye with the Congress. And so Quaid-e-Azam Muhammad Ali Jinnah, the leader of All India Muslim League, came up with his Jinnah 14 points in the year 1929. Some of the differences were that they said that the residuary powers should rest with the provinces, fearing that the Muslim leaders wouldn't get elected or wouldn't have so much participation at the central legislature, and they would be dominated by mainly Hindus. He felt that residuary powers should go to the provinces. And then the biggest concern was with respect to electorates. In Nehru's report, it was provided for that everyone, whether it would be the central legislature or the provincial legislature, they should be elected on basis of joint non-communal basis. That there shouldn't be any separate electorates for minorities, no safeguards for Muslims, as they feared that they would be dominated by a majority of Hindus at the center or at the provinces. And so Quaid-e-Azam Muhammad Ali Jinnah in his 14 points said that there should be separate electorates for Muslims and for minorities. However, the option should be given to them if they were to choose to change to joint electorates. There were certain other points as well, including provisions that there should be at least 1/3 representation of Muslims at the center, as well as at any cabinet being formed in different provinces. The Jinnah 14 points were given in 1929. In the year 1930, the famous Simon Commission published its own findings. They prescribed for, again, a federal form of government, that the system of diarchy should be removed, but there was no provision of responsible government at the center. However, this Simon Commission report again was boycotted, was not accepted by the political parties. And so following the publishing of this report, along with the recommendation which was made by Quaid-e-Azam Muhammad Ali Jinnah to Lord Irwin, the then Viceroy of India, as well as Ramsay MacDonald, the Prime Minister of India, a series of roundtable conferences were organized by the British government from the years 1930 to 1932, and the concern was that maybe a dominion status perhaps would be given to India this time. Now, before I get to the roundtable conferences, I would like to very briefly cover some of the important turn of events that happened in between. A major development took place in the year 1919 with the passing of the Rowlatt's Act by the Imperial Legislative Council. Now, this was a draconian act because it prescribed for arrests without warrants, indefinite detention without trial, no judicial review, and a person could be locked up for as many as 2 years without there being a trial, without there being any form of judicial review. And a great deal of protests were initiated against this draconian act. One very sad incident was the Jallianwala Bagh incident in the year 1919, when a group of non-violent protesters were fired upon by the British Indian Army, as a result of which some 379 people lost their lives and left 1,200 people wounded. And this set in motion a non-cooperation movement by a leader of the Congress, Mahatma Gandhi, which aimed to resist the British rule through non-violent means. Another major incident that took place in the year 1919 was the Khilafat movement, which was started by the Indian Muslims of the Indo-Pak subcontinent, started primarily by the Maulana brothers Muhammad Johar Ali and Shaukat Ali. This movement as such aimed to put enough pressure on the British government to preserve the Ottoman Sultan as the Caliph of Islam following the breakup of the Ottoman Empire. And so at some point in time, the Congress leaders also joined in the Khilafat movement, and the Khilafat movement became a major part of this non-cooperation movement. On one hand, they were advocating Khilafat, and on the other hand, the Congress leaders were advocating Swaraj, which was self-rule. However, this cooperation came to an end in the year 1922 with another sad incident of Chauri Chura, where the non-violent protesters came across, and because of some tussle, some 22 policemen were killed as a result of this sad incident. And so in the aftermath, Mahatma Gandhi decided to withdraw his non-cooperation movement, and ultimately the Khilafat movement also suffered, and the final death blow, if you may, was dealt when Mustafa Kemal Ataturk overthrew the Ottoman rule and established a more secular form of republic Turkey, as it was called. Now, another major incident took place in the year 1930, when there was, because of this Salt Act of 1882, a complete monopoly was given to the British government on the subject of salt, that no one else could produce it. And so followed a famous Dandi March, again by Congress leader Mahatma Gandhi, where he challenged this sort of monopoly that salt could be made because it was readily available, and so followed and ensued a sort of a civil disobedience movement all across India, where salt laws were challenged everywhere. And because of this, the British government came a bit heavy on them, and all the Congress leaders were locked up and arrested and detained in prison. So when the Round Table Conference, the first Round Table Conference, took place in November 1930, Congress leaders were not present, and because of non-participation of the important political party, no significant progress could be made. Following the Irwin-Gandhi Pact, when Congress leaders were present for the second Round Table Conference, much of the work was entrusted to the committees, and in the third Round Table Conference they pretty much discussed and examined what was studied by these respective committees. However, no real settlement or agreement could be reached nonetheless. Now, in the year 1932, a communal award was issued by Ramsay MacDonald, where the issue of electorate was put to rest, where he said that the system of separate electorate would be available for not just Muslims but other minorities, Sikhs, European citizens living, or any of the other minorities. This was the famous communal award issued in the 1932. In the year 1933, a white paper was issued. Now, a white paper is usually a very detailed report which talks about and gives proposals of how we should go forward about in terms of reforming the Constitution of India. This white paper was then examined by Joint Select Committee of the British Parliament, and after examining, a draft bill of the Government of India Act 1935 was ultimately resulted in the passing of Government of India Act 1935. Now, this Government of India Act 1935 was the last and perhaps the most longest act ever passed at that time by the British Parliament. Now, this completely changed the game altogether. It was a complete overhaul. They said that there's going to be a federal form of government. It would not be a unitary form of government. A unitary form of government is where the provinces are under the legislative and administrative control of the center. They don't have any existence. Any powers that they have are those that are delegated to them by the center. But with the passing of the Government of India Act 1935, it was clarified that the provinces as such would derive their authority from the Crown and not from the government. The system of diarchy was abolished from the provinces, so the principle of responsible government was fully put in motion at the provinces. However, diarchy to some extent was introduced at the center. There were certain subjects where the Governor General could act otherwise than in accordance with the advice of his ministers. Issues such as defense, external affairs, foreign diplomacy, and certain other matters were put in this list. Another major provision was that 3 lists were drawn, were sort of enumerated. There would be a federal legislative list, there would be a provincial legislative list, and then there would be a concurrent legislative list. However, one major point was missing. Actually, there were 2. The first one was that there was no concept of fundamental rights. Even though this was given, the idea was laid out in Nehru's report, also in the Jinnah 14 points that there should be fundamental rights. This was missed out in the Government of India Act 1935. And another issue was that people really expected that autonomy would be given, a dominion status would be given, and the dominion status was not given. The definition of dominion status came up in an imperial legislative meeting, council meeting in the year 1926, where they said that they are somewhat autonomous communities within the British Empire. They are with equal status, and they're not subordinate to one another in respect of either domestic or external affairs. But the irony of the Government of India Act 1935 was that such a status was not given. Some of the other provisions about how more powers would be given to the legislature, the principle of responsible government would be brought out. History tells us that many of these provisions never actually came into effect, and it were the councillors of the governor who actually continued to exercise the powers that they had been exercising before. Despite of the round table conferences and the passing of the Government of India Act 1935, It nonetheless was very much an act which was passed by the British Parliament, where even though the semblance, the spectre of participation of Indian actors was given, ultimately this white paper was examined by a joint select committee and it was passed by the British Parliament, and so it didn't involve that much of active participation of the Indian leaders on the ground. And so there was a demand that there must be a separate constituent assembly that should frame the Constitution of India. This demand came early as 1934 by the Communist Party of India. It was also endorsed and became a major demand of the Indian National Congress in the year 1935. Now, after the passing of this act, general elections were held at the provincial level in the year 1937, and Congress managed to form governments in some 8 of the 11 states. And so started the practice of hoisting Congress flags on government buildings. Singing of Bande Mataram was made compulsory in legislative assemblies, educational institutions, and the prevailing circumstances and the attitude of Hindus against Muslims somewhat convinced the Muslims that they needed to strive for a separate homeland. And the famous resolution which was passed on 23rd March 1940 at Lahore, that resolution sort of set forth the demand of a separate homeland, which was adopted by the Muslim League. The whole principle of two-nation theory, an idea that had been around even before the 20th century, was further expounded by the famous poet Allama Iqbal when he addressed a gathering to Muslim League in the year 1930. Now, in the year 1939, the Second World War broke out. Congress leaders resigned and they didn't agree to give support to the British on the premise that they were never consulted before a war was declared. And so in the year 1942, Sir Stafford Cripps, who was a war cabinet member of Winston Churchill cabinet, came from Great Britain to secure the support of the Indian leaders, and he promised a great deal of reforms and autonomy and powers which were to be given to the Indian people after the end of the war. Some of the findings of from what he gathered with different meetings he held with political leaders were that there would be a union of India, and if some states don't want to be a part of them, then they can form their own separate union, they could form their own separate homeland. That only certain powers would be given to the center, the rest of the powers would be given to the provinces. Congress rejected the Sir Stafford Cripps proposal on the basis that this was rather a post-dated check given to them by a failing bank. Muslim League initially accepted it because they felt that this would be a step in the right direction of demanding and urging for the creation of Pakistan. However, there was another clause which said that the constitution would be framed by the Indian political leaders, fearing that they would change everything and all the provisions, undermining the very essence of the Cripps proposal. The Muslim League also rejected the Cripps proposal, and the Congress started the Quit India movement, as a result of which most of the Congress leaders were again banished, they were put in prison, and they were arrested. However, in the year 1944, the Congress leaders again decided that they would withdraw their movement if the British agreed to give them independence and transfer their power, which the British were now amenable to at the end of the Second World War. Elections again now held in the year 1945, 1946. Firstly, there were elections at the center, where Muslim League managed to win all 30 of the reserved seats, and then followed elections in 1946, provincial elections, where again Muslim League captured and secured up to 95% of the Muslim vote. And Congress also did very well in their different constituencies. Now, the demand of Congress were that there should be a union of India, with the center being more powerful and having more powers, and that their constituent assembly should have the authority to frame their own constitution. Muslim League, however, since this was their mantra in the 1945-1946 elections, that they need a separate homeland, they also said they need a separate constituent assembly that would frame their own constitution, and that there should be separation first than anything else. And so a cabinet mission plan of 1946 followed, where 3 cabinet ministers came to India and held a different series of discussions. Their findings were that there should be one union of India, and that there would be different groups. So Sindh, Punjab and WFP Balochistan would be part of one group, Bengal and Assam would be part of other group, Hindus could have their own groupings. However, again, Congress was not very happy with the whole way the groups were being formed, and they had certain reservations again with certain provisions of Cripps Cabinet Mission that all powers should be given to the provinces and the center should be left with only few of the powers, and so Congress initially rejected the idea. But however, when the interim government was formed, the Congress joined in, they participated, and certain numbers, certain adjustments were made with respect to the seats. And so another event at that timeline was the 1946 Constituent Assembly elections. These were indirect elections, so the members of the Constituent Assembly were indirectly elected by the members of the Provincial Assembly who had won their seats in the provincial elections held in the year 1946. So now again there was somewhat of a tussle. On one hand, Congress wanted that there has to be a strong union and that their Constituent Assembly should go forward with framing of their constitution, whereas the Muslim League decided to refuse to partake in the constitution making exercise on the pretext that first there has to be a separation, otherwise they would dominate because they were in majority. And so ultimately the interim government management didn't succeed, didn't work out. The meeting sort of broke off with the whole direct action plan, and ultimately the cabinet mission plan failed. The next important turn of event was the Mountbatten Plan of 3rd June 1947, wherein the demand of the Muslim League for partitioning India into two separate homelands was agreed upon, that the Muslim majority provinces would form Pakistan, whereas all the rest would be part of Union of India. And so followed the Indian Independence Act of 1947, whereby two separate dominions were established, two separate constituent assemblies were entrusted with the task of framing their own constitutions. The Constitution or the Government of India Act 1935 would nonetheless apply. However, power was given to the Constituent Assembly to make any changes, and they would be now dominion. And so they would not owe their allegiance as such to the crown, to the Governor General, who may or may not be representative of the crown, as the Qaid-e-Azam Muhammad Ali Jinnah refused to take an oath, and there were certain changes which we will get to. And so followed this Indian Independence Act with the partitioning of India, and on 14th August 1947 Pakistan gained independence. So we're going to cut short our lecture here. And we are going to cover the constitutional cases, Maulvi Tamizuddin, Yusuf Patel reference, State versus Doso, Asma Jilani, Begum Nusrat Bhutto, Zafar Ali Shah. Very shortly we will be coming back and we will talk about these important constitutional cases, their link to laws, and with respect to some of the historical context and turn of events that we have referred. I hope that you have enjoyed this special lecture series, just the introductory. We will be returning back shortly. Thank you very much.